So this tool is called JuiceFS, and basically what it does is instead of using like the S3 command or Globus to work with the new buckets, you can just mount it as a regular directory and then use any of your existing scripts. So it can be basically its main use is to like retroactively make your existing scripts work with new stuff. So you just add a thing right at the top, mount this JuiceFS thing to this directory where you normally would be doing all your stuff. Then you just unmount it at the end. But before I get too far into it, it has a few limitations. So it has basically two modes. There's standalone, which one node can access it a specific thing at a time. So basically you'd use that if each node is doing its own thing and you just need a lot of storage. Then there's distributed mode, which requires like a separate server to be hosted by Hayak, or I guess Kopah. And so we don't have that set up. So standalone is the only one that we have. And so for very specific use cases, it can be very helpful. But first, I just want to talk about the fact that it's a bit funky. So if you if you try to mount the same bucket on multiple nodes, it doesn't always give you an error. But if you try to do anything, then it gives you an error. So there's just there's a couple things like that to be aware of. I haven't had time yet, but I'm gonna write up actual documentation for this. So that would be more if you do have issues for what you're doing, you could go and look the error, come to the support, but just know you never want to come to this first. It's if the other tools don't work or would take more time than your group has, you can then try this tool and it may get your stuff up and running very quickly. But look at your other options first.
And what would be your favorite option based on what you know?
So if you ideally you'd have each node just using its own data and they just happen to use a lot of storage, then you could, in like your Slurm array job or just in your Slurm script, you can mount a unique bucket for each node and then it just mount that right where you were putting your input output data already. And then you can have a bunch more data than Gscratch has. And then it can also work if you have one node running a couple jobs that share the data, then you just have to do a little bit of weird stuff with if statements, but it's not too bad. But so basically what you don't want it for is when everything is sharing the same output or processing the same set of data, because it can't really, it's not distributed. So first I'll talk about how to actually install it, because it's not on Hayak by default. So you normally would have to download it. Should I just use the one that you already loaded? Okay, so pretend this is download, like wget the file, and I have that here. That'll be on the documentation, but it's software/JuiceFS, just juice, right? And then you can put that into wherever your path is, like where you run directories from. Or programs from. Every home directory, I think by default has .local/bin. So .local/bin in your home directory will work. And so you can copy it there. And then now if you just type JuiceFS, the command's there. And so that's the what?
Command.
Oh, JuiceFS or the copy one? That's so I guess that does work if it's already there. Copy, and then so it's /software/JuiceFS, and then the actual executable is called JuiceFS. Why is it doing that? It's flashing. And then so that is the actual executable, and so we loaded that here before. It'll probably stay there. Okay, so yeah, you can just always do this. And then .local is a hidden directory in your home folder, and then bin is just where your local binaries or like local executables get put. And then so that's the name of it. And then now it's copied there, and if you type JuiceFS now, the shell will find it for you and run it. So that's really all you have to do to set it up. It's because the like how S3 had to do the configuration with your keys, it just kind of does that every time you use the command line. So it's a little annoying, but at least you don't need a setup file. So the first thing you need to do is actually create a JuiceFS bucket. So it doesn't use existing buckets, it like formats it in its own way. So you need JuiceFS format, and then it's a lot of flags, storage S3, bucket, and then you have to put the full URL to your bucket. So what is the Kopah URL? Kopah. No, it's like .uw.edu. I have an environment variable for this that I don't.
S3.kopah.uw.edu.
Okay. Okay. And then so you do that, and then you just put bucket name here. So I'll do my net ID so nobody has it. And then you have to do your access keys. And so I have environmental variables for this. So I'll just use those. So access - key. And then, and so this was, did you guys do S5 command setup at all?
S3 command.
Okay, so S5 is an alternative command to S3, and it's set up just with these environmental variables. So you just set that in your initialization, like your bash RC. And then so I just kind of use that for everything, but you can also copy and paste. I recommend just setting these up. It'll be on S5 documentation if we have that up when that gets up. Okay. Yes, yeah. So the S5 documentation has all the stuff to set up these variables.
If you don't have that, you can also just cat your Kopah file with your keys to the screen and then paste it in like you saw here. I'm glad you have those variables set up, so you're passing everyone your script.
And then, so those are all the flags it needs. And then now you actually tell it, this creates the, so the way standalone mode works is it has just a small database file that gets stored locally on the node that is accessing the bucket. And that's why it doesn't work with multiple nodes at the same time. What distributed mode does is it stores this database on a server that a bunch of nodes can access at the same time. So don't lose this file that you make, because if you do, your data is just unrecoverable. So the name doesn't really matter, so I'll just do this. And then this is the name of the database file, and then that last flag is the name of the actual database. I don't think it actually affects anything, but it's easiest just to have them as the same name. And so that should be it. Oh, okay. So you also have to do, this will do it as a foreground task. So it will just leave it open here with the, actually, wait, that's not what it's supposed to do. Maybe it just takes a second. That's the next command that's supposed to stay there. I literally just have this. So maybe it is, and I just forget what's there. Or, yeah, I think I just put the wrong thing there. None. And then so now it is created. If you go and look at your buckets, I guess it was there before, but pretend it wasn't there before, it'll make the bucket for you. And so if I go and look at the files in there, it's just like weird JuiceFS formatting. You can't look through a manual like this. You have to have that database. So just know it's there. So if you delete this or the database, your data is gone. Maybe you could recover it, but don't count on that. And then to actually use the data, you will do JuiceFS mount, and then you give it the database file you just created. And then so you give it the database file, and then where you actually want to mount it. So actually now I need to go back because I did not create a file for this. So you need to have an existing directory to mount to. It's not what it's supposed to be. Okay, I'll type it out again. Okay, so now I'll just give it the juice directory that I just made. And so you have to give it the -d flag, which is the same as the -- background. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. If you don't give it that, it just runs the mount as a service in the foreground here, and you'd have to open another terminal and do stuff. So if you don't do that, it will stay mounted until you kill this terminal or just Control-C out of it. And then that would be how you like stop the connection. But instead, you can give it the -d flag, which will let you come back into the terminal after saying it's ready. And then there's an unmount command that you can run later. So now there is, see this one's highlighted because it's a mount. So it is mounted now. There's nothing in it, I don't think. Yeah. And so this is where you would do the actual work. You could transfer all your data here. And so you could use this as just like an alternative to S3 command, actually work with it manually, but it's generally easier to use S3, S5. This is just kind of, these commands would be what you put in your script that gets run right before it so that you can then run all your existing commands on your data. And then you would run the unmount command I'm about to do at the end. And then, so I'll just do magic. So then this is in Kopah now. If I unmount this and remount it later, that file will be there because it's a storage service. And then, so once you're done doing all of your data processing, you do JuiceFS umount. It's not unmount because Linux things, because the official Linux command is umount. And then you just give it the directory it's mounted to. So this is the juice folder in my home. And so now it's not mounted anymore. If I do this, it's just a regular folder again right here. And if I go and ls juice, nothing in it. And so, and one of the pitfalls with this is if you have multiple SSH windows open, you could like mount in one and run it in the background and you forget about it. And then if you try and mount again later, it may or may not give you a warning when you do it. And then it will break when you try and do stuff later. So a helpful command is ps ux. This will list all of your JuiceFS mounts, like background services running. And then so this lists all the services under your account. And then grep JuiceFS. So this will search all the services running with the word JuiceFS in it. So there's nothing right now. This is just the command I ran right now. But if I had it mounted, I guess I'll bring it back up. So now it's up. And if I do that, it tells me whichever one this is, that top one. And so this command, I can see that there's currently a mount running. It tells me what database it's on and where it's mounted at because that was just in the command. I don't actually know what the second one is, but it's probably, I don't know. But if you had these running and you didn't know where they were, then the easiest way to kill them would just be copy this, the job ID, and then you can do kill job ID. And so this is where, that would be where it gets a little janky with JuiceFS. And I will unmount this again. Okay, and then, so that's the basics. And like I said earlier, the best way to use this is when you have just a job that needs a lot of storage, but not necessarily distributed service storage. So this is just a JuiceFS array job I wrote as an example. So, and this would be, it does one node, but with 8 jobs. So all of the jobs will be using the same mount here, which actually this should have been a little different, but I'll explain that in a second. And so all 8 of these jobs will be on the same node, which means they can share that same mount. So it'll basically just be a directory mounted straight to Kopah. You don't have to do anything fancy. It does it all for you, and it will use your existing code. And so it's just job man JuiceFS, does it with one node with 8 jobs. And so first we go into the local, this is just a local storage on the node, scratch. And then we create the JuiceFS bucket because it doesn't really work if it existed before. This is really only works for output data because it's input. It kind of works if each node has unique input, but it's best for output that then you can just parse later. And so you would format the bucket and then you make a directory to mount it to. So this, just make sure it's a unique name because it's your user and then the actual task. And then it mounts it with the same command we used before. So the thing that should be a little bit different is since this is only running on one node, you only need to mount once. So you would just do a thing here to make it so you would just do this as 0. So then when the first job runs, it mounts this, but then all the other ones won't go into that if statement. And so it would mount one bucket or one directory for all 8 jobs. And then we just go into the bucket and then copy some example data And so that would just be where your processing is, kind of a placeholder for your entire existing script. And then we just leave, unmount the directory, and this would also can be wrapped in that if statement if you were using single one. So this would be the last job will run this, first job does this, last job does that, and then just unmounts it, cleans up the thing, and then now all of your output is in Kopah instead of gscratch or whatever storage you were using before. And probably not, I'm not going to run this because we'd have to like wait in the queue and stuff, but this will be posted on a documentation I make later, and it'll probably be in that email you were talking about.
Perfect. Yeah. So as far as what this will do quite practically, many of us are in the situation where we generate huge amounts of output from ultra atmospheric models. So I've got terabytes of stuff, and then post processing, we want to look at little pieces of it. Ideally, we want to look at little pieces of it without having to download the whole thing to our soul host. Can this essentially do that? Or you have to...
This is not the tool, but my next presentation is the exact tool you want. It's the Boto3 library, which is designed like a Python library designed to work with Kopah storage. So it allows you to like stream small chunks of data at a time and process them. So then you get around the latency issues and stuff that normal networking storage would have. So yeah, that's pretty much exactly what you would want the next tool for.
You mentioned that the SQLite database, if you're losing the potential is bad, is that if it's not properly synced up first, or?
You just need the file stored somewhere. So probably what I would recommend is just like copy that maybe into gscratch and like your lab folder, or maybe just back to your local or like your personal device so that it's for sure safe. It doesn't really need anything special. It's just a text file that when you run the JuiceFS mount command, it reads that. So as long as it's intact and not corrupt somewhere, you'll work if you point it to it. Because in that where you do the SQLite 3 : // that's a full path to a thing. So it just happened to only be the name because it was in my current directory. So that could be a full path wherever you store it.
And once it's pushed out in the Kopah, you're not worried about that file.
It never gets pushed up into Kopah. So that's the difference between standalone and distributed. So distributed, you'd never have that local database with distributed. The server, which is like a separate service running on, it would be a separate service running on Kopah. It would have that database that then any network device trying to connect to it can just query that, and then it stores the metadata of the files, like file size and stuff. And then so you will always need that, and the data's stored there, but you have no idea what the metadata is without that database.
Just on sort of an approximate estimation basis, how big does that file get? You put, say, 1,000 files.
Yeah, it had
We have a ratio of how big that file grows with your days.
Yeah, on the Juice docs, I remember seeing that. I remember it was 3 or 6 were the numbers. Don't remember the thing. So maybe kilobytes? I don't remember the exact size. It's on the Juice docs. Could you maybe look that up? It's the JuiceFS standalone the distributed docs. It says the file. Yeah, it was not very big. It was like megabytes for thousands of files, I think. And so this was technically for distributed mode, but I imagine the sizes would be about the same. Because it's literally just like the file size, maybe like permissions and owner. It's just the metadata of what would normally be stored for a file.
So if you create this directory, load a big data set like a terabyte tarball, and then you wanted to share it through Globus, could you pop into Globus and like see that file?
I don't think so. So the bucket would be there. You could see the data technically, but since it's like formatted with this database, it would be a little bit weird. So honestly, I think the best way would be is you have this job runs, you have the data there, and then you just kind of have a separate job that copies it back down one at a time so that you aren't using a bunch of gscratch storage, and then puts it back up with like S5 command or something. This really is just like if you have a very like hard to work with script that you need to get working on Kopah, it's generally not going to be the tool you want.
And that's really because you can use like CP, right? Like you can use regular Linux commands to move things in and out of this boundary. That's I think that's the convenience that you're getting, is that you have these commands that you're more familiar with to use and that maybe are already hard-coded into your scripts. But other than that, I think you're better. We did want to demonstrate it because it's something that folks have asked for.
Have you tried like our clone mount as like a mount function also?
No, I have not. And so what does it do?
It's the same thing. So I think it uses the same convention as like S3 with files where the file for object is in case the pad.
Okay. Yeah, so that's basically just like our clone has its own S3 API that it works with.
He uses Fuse.
Okay. I think so. Yeah, I think I've seen it in the debugging stuff. So that seems pretty similar. And then so does it kind of do that like under the like it doesn't provide this user space thing, right? It has a method to access S3 buckets and can do that under the covers.
Yeah, so our clone supports S3, and then there's a mount command which will put aside S3 bucket and mount it to a folder.
Okay. That sounds like a similar tool that you might want to use instead. Because
like speed benefits or hell.
yeah, so I don't know about our clone, but I did do some basic speed testing on this. It seems to be just regular G-Scratch storage seems to be about 10 times faster than this. So it's like 50 megabytes per second, I think it came out to, versus 500 megabytes per second. And then S3 and S5 were a little bit faster than Juice, like maybe 100 megabytes. So it really is like, this is your last option, but it can be a very helpful tool to save time for those awkward scripts. Because yeah, like she was saying, the main advantage is that it's just a Unix directory that that the JuiceFS service sends up to Kopah. So you can use the regular copy, move, or just use it as a file like you would with any regular, like when you did JuiceScratch. Yeah, I think the last thing was just the way that you would do it with multiple nodes sharing the bucket, but I kind of talked about that already. And that'll be more detail on the write-up. But basically it's just you have to limit it to one of the jobs per node actually does the JuiceFS stuff.